All right, everyone. Well, thank you guys so much, and huge thanks to the Signifyd team for asking me up here. I didn't include an introduction when I was planning this, but Bennett inspired me. So I'll pretend he's asking me some of the same questions. What is my favorite career advice? Like day one out of undergrad, someone told me effectively, like, don't be good at a shitty job, but what she said was carve out clear areas of incompetence. And so that's the advice I give to people all the time as well. In your professional life, it's, if you hate making slides, don't become the person who makes slides. If you hate making sure the AV can connect in a room and that paralyzes you with fear, don't become the person that does that. In my personal life, I hate laundry, so it is a clear area of incompetence in my marriage, and we make that work. So, with that introduction, I've been in payments for a really long time. I fell into it completely accidentally. I was at KKR when we bought First Data, and I went from an interim CMO of Chevy's Fresh Mix, which had been the first thing I was doing there, and then I went from that straight into First Data. But I've loved this ecosystem. In particular, I think the thing I love most about payments is the value chain. So the fact that we have partners like a Signifyd that, we become a channel distribution partner for them, they become a vendor to us. We compete with each other in some places. They certainly have competitors of ours that they have equal relationships with. But the dynamicism of the value chain is just like what really drives me and gets me excited every day. So with that said, I thought I'd do a little bit of just what WorldPay is. Many of you guys in the room, I'm lucky to call customers. Many of you guys I have worked with previously in former roles. But WorldPay, we process $2.5 trillion. So we're one of the three largest. Each of the three largest is about $2.5 trillion. Just to put that in context, we'd be the 7th largest country in the world, so just behind France and ahead of Italy, in terms of total payment volume if that was GDP. We process 55 billion transactions. That's 1 billion a week. Regularly we hit kind of 5,000 transactions a second. So really, really high scale as an acquirer. The thing I love most about the WorldPay business is our surface area. So we're processing in 146 countries. That's 75 on local licenses, 55 on actually our own licenses. So able to do really fluid local processing. We've got 65 APMs. And we've really kind of notched up our innovation in that space. We're delivering 11 new APMs this year, including things like Pix in Brazil, which dovetails really nicely to the conversation you heard earlier with Carlo. In terms of who we serve, we are very significantly kind of an e-commerce player as well as enterprise. So 7 of the 10 top retailers, 9 of the 10 top airlines. But we also go all the way down into small business. Part of the business that I like the most is what I call multi-party, where we serve large enterprises that make buying decisions on behalf of many, many small businesses that sit behind them. So whether that's in the marketplace model, an ISV, an ISO, a PayFac, we have a lot of that space. We do almost $1 trillion of multi-party. So get to see franchises and things in that type of space. And then we do have a small business business as well. All right, so the crux of what I came to talk about today is, e-commerce optimization to me is this multivariable equation that you're constantly trying to solve. So if I was to put myself in the shoes of each one of you in the room who, is waking up trying to solve for the growth of, your e-commerce P&L while protecting the downside risk, there's a series of KPIs that you're solving for at any time. At the core, you're trying to grow revenue. But you want to maximize the throughput of your customers that make it through the good customers while managing the downside risk. And then also kind of delighting the customers while you do it with a great customer experience. Why do we care? There's a couple of pages here with some of the stats. E-commerce itself is still going to grow, in excess of the economy. So if the economy is growing 3 to 4%, we continue to see an 8 to 10% top line in e-commerce. And when we think about the experience that consumer has, that differential between every consumer that makes it through the shopping cart to try to pay and what ultimately becomes revenue, that becomes such an opportunity to be able to go seize as we're thinking about how to optimize. So, in this group, I think that everybody is probably managing this KPI around their fraud, but also always looking at the other side of the lever of what's the auth rate, are we getting everybody through the pipe that we're trying to get through? CNP, of course, 7 times the fraud. This is where the fraud moves to. Much earlier in my career, I was at Visa, and we used to talk about the fraudster population as this very squishy ecosystem that just runs to the most vulnerable point. So as soon as card present, was able to lock down lost and stolen and move everything to chip, and be able to reduce the ability of scammers to be able to create a magnetic swipe, that same amount of fraud in the ecosystem just moves to the next most vulnerable point, which becomes e-commerce. And of course, in this world, we do that in a world in which, in the US at least, the merchants then take on all of that liability. So it becomes even more critical that we're managing the loss risk associated with the revenue upside. Part of what you guys are also always managing is, the customers that you get through. So in terms of trying to delight the customers that you do see, as the cost of customer acquisition goes up and up, that becomes even more critical, right? So, we have a 222% increase in the cost of customer acquisition because we're all paying, Meta, Facebook for all of those leads, and the cost of that is so high that if we're not able to convert those customers in the shopping cart experience and into a good off, that's really just wasted money from a top-line perspective. So this, to me, is the crux of what e-commerce optimization is. So I used to say that there was this triad that we were constantly solving for, which was your auth rate always trying to go up, your fraud tolerance and risk always trying to manage the downside, and then all of that balanced with the cost optimization. So can we drive this to a payment method that has the lowest possible cost of acceptance? I've added over the course of the last 3 years an equal importance on the customer experience. So can we do a low latency transaction? Can we digitally authenticate the consumer without them having to bring any authentication method into that transaction? And can we do it without them really even having to be aware of that authentication experience? So frictionless UX paired with these other 3 that we're trying to manage. So let's tackle these each one at a time. Risk, we're here at Signifyd's conference. We're really lucky to partner with Signifyd with a guaranteed payments product. This is something that we have hundreds, maybe even thousands of customers in common with. What we do here is we allow fully integrated into the integration. We allow Signifyd to be able to see all of the data that we're able to get in that transaction. We send it over to them in advance of the transaction processing, and then the combination of tools that they share with you all allows them to be able to say that this is something that we feel very comfortable we can allow through as an off, and then they'll take on the risk liability in the event that there's a chargeback. What I think is so important about this solution is that it's really doing a good job of both lifting the off as well as managing the downside risk. I missed a slide here, but why is this important? Of course, like $48 billion of fraud losses, but even more, this $445 billion of lost off to a good customer. So being able to manage the 2 sides of that equation is so, so critical anytime that you're watching your fraud. So we have this great case study with Lenovo. So kudos to Carlo for having been on stage right before me. This partnership started in 2022, so we're about 3 years into it. We process Lenovo globally, but in particular, we launched this partnership in the US, the UK, and Canada. And what their call to action was they wanted to kind of take the fraud management out of their environment, lessen their ops cost associated with it. They were getting flooded with needing to do these manual reviews of potential consumers, and it was just becoming a very costly experience to them. Following the implementation of guaranteed payments as part of the Signifyd solution with us, we were able to do 2 things simultaneously: lift their auth rate by 6.6%. So they had been in their concerns of potentially carrying more cost and driving more checks into their manual centers. They were actually losing 6.6% of potential revenue that was good customers and good transactions. at the same time as they were able to reduce a 99% reduction in manual reviews. So they were able to lessen that auth cost while able to delight the customer, grow revenue, and be able to do the top line. And of course, because of the guaranteed nature of the product, they're also able to do that with zero liability. So I think this was a great example of a customer solution that is able to come in and tackle both sides of that equation in parallel. Oh, there's some animation there. In particular, a lot of acquirers, a lot of solutions end up with a fraud tool that is, part of their overall solution. One of the things I actually like the most about this product is that it's not just about having fraud and being able to insert a fraud check into the authorization, but it's really critical when you do it. So very frequently, the fraud tool will kind of deliver a simultaneous message that you initiate the auth check with the networks at the same time as you deliver a fraud check to a secondary fraud engine. If you do that, and then your fraud tool comes back, says we think this is likely fraud, you'll actually just go cancel the auth. So whether or not you had a good auth in that situation, what's going to end up happening is that the network saw this transaction. So if it was bad, they saw a bad auth come through, or they're seeing all this activity associated with canceled auths. So part of your goal is always going to be that you want to send issuers the cleanest traffic. So the more you send them high-quality traffic, the more that they trust. If you think about their risk scoring, they're going to reach deeper into the risk scoring tables and allow you to have that trust because you've earned it. It also will prevent a lot of the costs associated with bot attacks, so you can keep all of that kind of outside the door of any takeover. So it's really important as you think about structuring your fraud solutions into your e-commerce flows that it happens pre-transaction rather than just in parallel to the transaction itself. All right, so my newest favorite topic is really about this consumer optimization. So how do we deliver the nirvana experience is that a consumer becomes digitally authenticated to who they are. So I go onto a web page I've never shopped at before. I get digitally authenticated. This is clearly Cindy Turner. I'm preloaded with a payment credential. So this is the Sapphire card that she wants to shop with. And I'm preloaded with all of the other factors that you would need to get out of that. So to be able to say, here's the shipping address that she's likely to use, here's the shipping time frame that she's likely to choose, here's the way that she is likely to want to pay. If that can happen in a friction-free environment, then you can drive the maximum flow through and reduce your cart abandonment. So cart abandonment, certainly there's some amount of cart abandonment that's just shopping experience. I want to save this in case I want to buy it later. But a huge piece of it is I don't know my CVV, or gosh, this website is really poorly set up and I can't autofill my card into it, and I don't feel like walking downstairs to where my wallet's sitting and fill in that card, and then I forget to ever come back and make that purchasing decision. So limiting that payment friction, particularly in any of the guest checkout experiences, is going to be critically important. And when you have a card on file, to be able to digitally authenticate into that profile is particularly important. So, as we talk about here, a couple just, pieces of advice that you're thinking about. So friction is the enemy. Anytime that you need an entry of data, anytime that you aren't taking advantage of every single component of the digital signature to be able to authenticate that customer. If you're not giving them the options, consumers show up with a way that they want to pay, and if they don't see that way reflected on the page, they're likely to pull themselves out of the process. So whether that in the US is just a digital wallet versus a card, a button, a buy now, pay later option, as you go outside the US, that gets infinitely more complex. So people want to pay with a direct debit, they want to pay with an open banking mechanism. It is up to you to kind of be able to serve their needs of what they're looking for. I do think latency is important here. I'm not sure if this is a slide I was going to talk about latency, but I've watched a lot of flows in e-commerce experiences that isolate payments latency. which might be, in a perfect world, it should certainly be under 1 second. But you might see it stretch to 2 to 3 seconds in some scenarios. And when that is isolated as just a payments experience, it feels really jarring to the consumer when they watch a box swirl on payments. I think Uber and Lyft have a really good side-by-side that you guys should all go check out. Uber has bundled their payments latency, which includes them calling into a vault, pulling the card down from the vault, and then taking that card, sending it to a processor, which is not always the same as their vault, and making the entire transaction. They've got about a 3-second window while they do all of those steps. They've bundled that into the 2 to 5 minutes that you're standing on the side of the road waiting for them to match you with a driver. So you sit there and you're watching and you're like, oh God, they're finding a driver, they're finding a driver. They're also doing a payments check, but you don't feel it as a consumer. Lyft, actually, when you go through their flows, they authenticate you to the card. So they say, okay, you've agreed to this ride, it's going to be $30.22. And you do that, and then it flips you all of a sudden into a 3-second flow, which feels like, oh gosh, like why is this circling? Are they having trouble finding my card? I don't understand what's happening. And then you get a screen that's like, okay, your card is good, now we're going to find you a driver. And as a consumer, that experience, that extra, it feels like 3 extra seconds. It's probably not 3 extra seconds, but it's just a really bad customer experience. So, thinking through the entirety of latency and where you introduce any kind of exhibition of latency to the consumer, I really think is critically important in a modern interface. And so then we'll get into kind of this last pair of auth optimization. So auth optimization is something that is a huge part of the conversation these days in acquiring, in payments. There are so many ways in which we've all learned together of how we can optimize a transaction. So we need to have the right message formatted. We need to have a card that's up to date. We need to have matched it to all of the data elements associated with the card to be able to get it through. When we're in a subscription world, we need to be trying that at the right time. We need to be retrying it across multiple patterns. So many different tools that are associated with the auth optimization. The tool that came up as we've watched the debit networks and pinless be able to scale is that the debit networks actually, even though they go to the same issuer, they bring a very different formatted message to that issuer. So we actually are able to see that there's auth differences between pinless networks at the same time as there's certainly cost differences. I would say this is probably the area that most obviously lends itself to AI. So every single modern acquirer at this point is using AI-based retry tools where they're able to recognize these patterns and to be able to optimize according to your needs. Like what is your relative cost of the transaction, and how do you want to think about being able to optimize for cost, which all of the debit routing tables have always optimized for cost. How do we take that and add the angle that we also want to optimize for authorization? And I would add, when we're doing that in a transaction flow, also optimizing for maximum latency, because you can retry a transaction that is on a signature network that is a stored transaction many, many times. You get a month that you're really able to, retry your 17 times. But when you have a consumer standing on the side of the road waiting for an Uber, you get 2 tries, maybe 3 tries. And so how do you want to think about maybe a slightly higher auth rate coming from one network versus a cost at the other, and to be able to optimize that? So a data-driven approach here. Again, this is the wealth of data that exists in these tables is just such an obvious use case for machine learning. We've been doing that for a long time. It is the modern standard for any kind of retry, any kind of routing optimization. And then you want to pair that with all of the right visibility, transparency, and reporting associated with it. Great. In terms of cost optimization, so of course, this is just a page to show like the variety of costs associated with a transaction is such a difference, right? So we can go from anything from an open banking transaction that, if it's running just ACH can cost just pennies, all the way up through, a credit transaction, some of the buy now pay later transactions that are, if credit is 2.75 or 2.5 from an interchange perspective, the buy now pay laters might be at 4%. So we've got this 400 basis point gap, right, of different costs of payment. And each of them deliver a variation in terms of the customer experience, a variation in terms of the click-through and the friction-free, as well as a difference in that auth rate. So to be able to look at each of those different channels and really evaluate like what your what is the profit contribution of that type of transaction to you? All right. So, in summary, I think the point is that I hope all of you guys are managing, the dynamic set of interactions between these different levers. And in isolation, looking just at fraud or looking just at auth rate, that's never going to be the right answer. So we always have to think about, this variation of what's the cost of the payment, what's the auth lift that I get from the payment, what's the customer experience that I left the customer with, and then what is the fraud cost that I end up having to manage. So I think with that said, we left some time for questions. Hopefully I didn't go too fast. We have like a whole 20 minutes left, so hopefully there's some good.
All right. First of all, let's give a big round of applause. Thank you, Cindy. All right, we have mic runners here, so just go ahead and raise your hand if you would like to ask Cindy a question from WorldPay. Don't be shy. Oh, we've got one over here. Danielle, she's going to come to you. Thank you.
Thanks. Oh, okay. Thanks so much, Cindy. I wanted to ask, so first off, love the Uber analogy, ex-Uber here, so always love a shout out on good design there. I'd really love to hear more if you have any tips about how to kind of measure the customer experience impact that you talked about of like embedding payments and friction in payments, because I think that's something that in my experience, we all know it can be friction. How do you really work with like another team that might own that friction experience to quantify it for decision making?
Yeah, I mean, in a perfect world, you can run A/B tests, right? So you can make some changes to one of the interfaces, present it to a certain percentage of your customers, and be able to measure the flow through, right? So, and be able to quantify that. I would also say, watching the clicks. So, I'm sure all of you guys do, user groups or, watch a customer actually interact with your pages. If you're seeing comments on it, if you see, the reactions to it, I think that being able to touch and feel it, like I get a tremendous amount from spending time both with my customers who are businesses, but then also with their customers and watching those interactions. At its core, I'm a big Net Promoter Score believer. It's very difficult to isolate what movement in Net Promoter Score would come from like a change to taking friction out of the process. But I would guess that you would see lift from it. So, if you can run that as a nice isolated A/B test, that would certainly be the right outcome.
Thank you.
Cool. Next question. All right, well, let's give her a
One
big,
behind.
oh, sorry.
You mentioned earlier around card on file and being able to kind of skip over the CVV AVS portion of that. I know there's a lot of card networks that require that if a fraud transaction comes in. Are you seeing that some of the networks are getting a little bit more lax and not requiring that to dispute it if it is card on file?
So, I mean, I think if you strip CVV, a perfect transaction certainly has CVV, and you're going to qualify for the best interchange if CVV is included. If you strip CVV from a card that's stored on file, and you still submit it as a merchant-initiated transaction, you will see an auth lift because it's frequent enough that those cards have changed, and it's actually that the CVV itself has changed. I don't know if it comes with a liability shift. I would guess the liability is already sitting with the merchant, so it's probably like, I don't know if it would reduce your likelihood of winning that transaction. It would come with a higher interchange. So, I think that's a trade-off. If you're selling a digital good, whether it's a subscription of some kind, as long as a box of things isn't going out the door, getting that extra $20 in the month and the revenue and retaining that customer, I see most customers are willing to make that trade of stripping CVV in a retry. You would always have the first attempt include CVV in that case. I would say tokenization. I mean, I didn't talk about all of the nuances of retry, but the tokenization, like a network token, has effectively subscribed to Visa MasterCard's account updater. So that's what Visa MasterCard's token vault subscribes itself to its own account updater service for free. Then you don't pay Visa, 17 cents. Instead, you've subscribed to that account update for free. We always like to keep both the token on file, so we like to keep the original PAN and keep the token. We would always try the token first. The token's going to give you much better performance, but there's times where reverting back to the PAN, either because you can take that pan down a pinless route where you might actually see a different outcome, or there's just some amount of variation that you'll end up getting a positive auth on the pan that you didn't get on the token. So it is, to me, really critical that you do have both.
Very nice. Another question? Oh, here I am, right here. Ooh, watch me, watch me, watch me. This is how I stay so thin. Here we go. And you get a card, you get a card.
I love it. Everything you shared so far was wonderful, so thank you.
A
A little higher, sorry. Thank you for sharing everything you have so far. Super valuable. The question I have is, we obviously in the checkout process, as both partners to you guys and as customers ourselves, certain partners or return businesses we save our credit card with, but we're also seeing a rise in digital wallet. Are you guys seeing any pain points with more people maybe going to digital wallets and that type of verification versus the traditional customer saving their card on file, seeing anything in regards to abandoning the cart if there's an additional step from using the digital wallet versus having it saved through the checkout process with that specific company?
Yeah, so I think digital wallets are in two buckets. So I do the Apple Pay, Google Pay, where it's really just a pan that's a token that's inserted into your process versus a staged digital wallet, which is like the PayPals of the world. Either one, what they've solved is frictionless consumer experience, right? So the fact that I can double click on my phone and I'm 2 clicks to having entered my address, my shipping information, the card credentials, I didn't have to remember it. Even in a perfect world where your e-commerce has been optimized to autofill with everything I already have given Apple to store in Safari, it's still a frictionless experience to have done that in Apple Pay. I think the staged digital wallets have also solved for that. So they've digitally recognized the consumer. They may have a trusted relationship with that brand. They may feel like they get some kind of better dispute management or trust in them as a consumer. Or that it's keeping their credentials in some kind of way that they get nervous about a brand having their credentials. So I do think that there's consumers that just have a stated preference for it. I think it will continue to take up. So unless there's like some kind of protocol, and that's probably the thing I'm watching the most closely. I have all of the different instant checkouts in my ear, as I'm sure many of you guys do as well. So Pays is coming at it with a bank perspective that's just going to ever have card in it. Has the 5 largest banks may or may not scale beyond that, but is never going to be able to take your private label, right? So if your private label card is sitting with Synchrony, that's pretty much never going to get in Pays. So how do you think about that? PayPal, a former employer of mine, with their fast lane, I think it's well designed. They've probably got the best surface of consumers that they recognize. I think their numbers like 92, 93% of consumers, they can digitally authenticate just based on the digital fingerprint. How does that scale? How do they think about it? I think that's probably still up for debate, but it may be there. We're a partial owner in Signifyd. I'm on the board of Signifyd. I think they have a really unique approach. They've got Amex, which Pays is not going to have, and then they've got Synchrony, so they've got all your private labels. But they're going to struggle to pick up the other side of the rest of distribution. So one of these is going to scale. There's other players out there. Bolt is still like trying to sell everyone. But one of these is going to scale. Our approach is we're going to probably end up supporting 2 to 3 or maybe 4 of them because our merchants will guide us into that choice, and we're happy to do it. But I think that's probably the way that we kind of collectively leapfrog a digital wallet, just taking the share of those transactions.
Time for one more. Here you go.
Hi, John Michael Ball, AutoZone. Thanks for the insights you've given already today. We have probably it's not a unique problem, probably something that other people experience. When we have large purchases, say for like an engine or a transmission, like this $5,000 order, the original token pan comes back, it's authorized. The customer looks good from a fraud perspective with the current tools we have. But when we try to run the transaction, it fails. Authorization fails. So I'm wondering if there's any data that WorldPay could provide, or if there is something that maybe we could leverage from the issuer. If because we make some assumptions before canceling the order.
Yeah.
Is this a stolen credit card, or is this? Does the customer maybe have a limit on their daily spending? How can we make that decision without having to maybe even call the customer?
Yeah, so I would separate, just this is purely hypothesis-driven, happy to chat after if you wanted to give us more specifics. But there is a rising amount of what I would say is really consumer fraud, which is consumers with largely Cash App, but there's a couple other players, as their payment mechanism. So I don't know if you guys have downloaded Cash App. I have like 1,000 wallets on my phone because I just like the consumer experience. But what Cash App has enabled as their consumer value proposition is that you can put the power of managing payments in the hands of that consumer, right? So it's really just a prepaid card. It's just a prepaid wallet that's been funded with some kind of bank transfer, even like, cash was the origination of it. But what it lets the consumer do is turn off a merchant. So the consumer can go in, you can run a pre-auth for $200 or something like that, and then all of a sudden they need, something more, right? So they try to add to the basket. And if you trust that original, like, if you have a good auth, like, you should always be able to clear up to that auth amount. But what the consumer can do with Cash App is turn off all incremental auth associated with it, as well as turn off merchant-initiated transactions. So subscription-based merchants, a lot of consumers are using a Cash App card to be able to preload the first transaction. Maybe they get a $0 auth on that first transaction. It goes through as good. They take their 30 days of free services or their first box, whatever it is, and then the consumer goes off and turns it off. And then they typically are going to end up getting, 2, 3, 4 months of payments while you guys try to rerun that and maybe give them the benefit of the doubt. So you can isolate that in bin. So there's very specific bins they're all the Marqeta bins. I'm going to forget the names of the issuers. Sutton Bank, I think, is the biggest one. So you can go into bin tables and you can isolate exactly which is Cash App based on those bins of the issuer. I would look at what percentage of your behavior that you're struggling with is actually just related to those bins. Outside of that, I would say, I would probably interrogate like what you're doing in your original auth. As long as you have an auth, you should be able to clear it. So nothing should be standing in the way of you being able to clear the transaction at the amount that you originally authed. So if you authed $5,000 for the transmission, whatever it is, you should be able to clear it to that amount. And then if you're not winning your chargebacks because they're saying that, this wasn't something I bought or whatever, I would say let's go into your chargeback data and understand exactly what you're submitting if there's an opportunity to increase. So there's a bunch of first-party fraud tools out there which can help you go win your chargebacks.
All right, that was great. Great questions. Let's give her a big round of applause again for Cindy Turner.
Thank you all. I appreciate it.
Thank you, Cindy.